Today's mindful moment. Ever find yourself like wanting a pleasurable experience to be over? Weird thought, all right?
Yeah.
But our brains are kind of constantly balancing this like pleasure and pain thing.
Yeah.
And so today we're diving into Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lembke
Okay.
to figure out this whole science of reward and how it shapes our lives.
Right.
You might be surprised how easy it is to get like hooked on anything,
Oh, yeah.
from chocolate to
Yeah.
even social media.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And we'll talk about why the world we live in now is like a huge buffet of addiction.
Oh, I like that.
But don't worry, we'll also get into some positive stuff, like how to control ourselves better and find a healthier balance.
Yeah, good.
You know, it's interesting how Dr. Lemke uses these personal stories and things from her patients to make neuroscience relatable.
Yeah, for sure.
She doesn't just like throw a bunch of scientific terms at you.
Right.
She actually connects the science to like real life,
Yeah.
like that cracked desk in her office.
Oh, yeah, what about that?
She got it from a colleague who had it before her. It's literally split down the middle.
Oh, wow.
And she sees it as this metaphor
Okay.
for how broken her patients feel when they come to her,
Mm-hmm.
but also like how they can heal.
Right.
And that sets the tone for the whole book.
That's really cool.
So what about the science itself? Like what's happening in our brains when we feel pleasure?
Well, it all comes down to these things called neurotransmitters,
Okay.
specifically this one called dopamine.
Dopamine.
Yeah, it's often called the feel-good chemical.
Right.
And it's a huge part of how our brains understand rewards.
Mm.
So like when we do something fun,
Mm-hmm.
like eating a great meal,
Yeah.
or even scrolling through social media,
Okay.
dopamine gets released and it makes us feel satisfied.
Okay, so we get this like rush of dopamine when we do something we enjoy.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then where does the pain come in?
Well, that's what's so interesting.
Okay.
Our brains process both pleasure and pain in the same spot.
What?
Yeah. It's like a balanced scale,
Okay.
So when that dopamine rush fades away, the scale tips over to the pain side.
So then we feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Or even like we're craving something.
Oh, so it's like we're always chasing this feeling of satisfaction,
Mm-hmm.
which explains why we always want that second piece of chocolate.
Exactly. And as we keep indulging, doing the thing over and over,
Yeah.
we build up a tolerance. So we need more and more
Oh.
to get that same feeling of pleasure.
Okay.
And this can become like a dangerous cycle,
Right.
especially because it's so easy to find things that give us these dopamine rushes.
It's true. Dr. Lemke calls it an addiction buffet,
I love that.
which is pretty accurate, right? Like we have instant access to everything.
Oh, yeah.
Information, entertainment, food delivery, you name it.
It's all right there.
We're constantly being tempted.
That's true.
That's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
We're all just going to become addicts.
Not necessarily. Dr. Lemke has this framework she calls dopamine. It stands for objectives, problems, mindfulness insight, and next steps.
Wow, it's a lot.
It is, but it makes sense.
Okay, break it down for me.
Okay, so she uses this case study
Mm-hmm.
of a teenager named Delilah who was struggling with cannabis.
Okay.
And it illustrates the framework perfectly.
So how does it work?
Okay, so first, Dr. Lemke figured out Delilah's objectives for using cannabis.
Objectives like why was she using it?
Exactly, like what need was it fulfilling?
Gotcha.
And in Delilah's case, she thought she needed it to deal with her anxiety.
So she wasn't using it just to get high?
Right. It was more about coping with something.
Interesting.
Then they moved on to the problems,
Right.
like what bad stuff was happening because of her cannabis use.
Mm.
It took some real honesty and self-reflection
Right.
to admit the negative consequences.
And that's where the mindfulness comes in, right?
Exactly.
Like being aware of those cravings and triggers.
Yeah.
And learning to not give in.
The goal is to gain insight into your behaviors
Huh.
and how those dopamine activities impact your life.
Right.
And finally, you figure out your next steps.
So what are the next steps?
Well, it could be continuing to abstain
Okay.
or finding healthier ways to manage those needs,
Right.
or even coming up with strategies for like responsible consumption if that's possible.
So it's not just about willpower, but having a plan.
Exactly. And that plan might include this concept called self-binding.
Self-binding. That sounds intense.
Think of Odysseus tying himself to the mast of his ship
Okay.
so he could hear the sirens singing but not get lured to his death.
Oh, I remember that story.
Yeah, so self-binding is like that.
So you're creating barriers to protect yourself from temptation.
Exactly. One patient, Jacob, who was struggling with sex addiction,
Okay.
realized he needed to restrict access to anything sexually suggestive.
Like just pornography.
More than that, even certain TV channels and websites.
Wow.
It's a huge commitment, but sometimes you need to make big changes.
Right.
Another patient, Mitch, was addicted to sports betting. And he used self-binding by avoiding anything sports-related.
So he couldn't even watch games.
Nope, not even the sports section of the newspaper.
That's dedication.
He even got himself banned from the local casinos.
Really?
Yeah, but those are just two examples. Dr. Lembke has lots of stories.
That's great.
About patients using self-binding to regain control of their lives.
It's inspiring.
Something that really stood out to me was the focus on radical honesty.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like a shift from the science, but it actually makes sense.
It does.
Dr. Lembke argues that being honest with ourselves and others is so important if we want to make lasting changes.
That's like the foundation.
Yeah, for breaking free from addiction and finding a more balanced life.
So what does that look like in practice?
She has some amazing stories of patients who found healing through radical honesty.
Okay, tell me more.
Like David, who had really bad social anxiety.
Oh.
He used exposure therapy, forcing himself to do things that terrified him.
Like what?
Like talking to strangers. He'd literally write out conversations and practice them in the break room at work.
With random people.
Yeah, he pushed himself to connect, even when it was super uncomfortable.
That's brave.
It is. But he kept pushing himself,
Uh-huh.
and gradually his anxiety decreased. And he started having real connections with people.
That's amazing.
It shows how facing our fears can lead to growth.
So it's not just about avoiding temptation.
Right.
But about being honest about our struggles
Yeah.
and reaching out for connection.
You got another patient, Maria,
Okay.
overcame alcohol addiction through honesty and self-reflection in Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay.
By admitting her struggles and connecting with others who understood.
Right.
She was able to break free from the shame that kept her trapped.
Shame is powerful.
It is, and that's where the pro-social shame cycle comes in.
Okay, what's that?
It's this idea that shame can actually motivate us to seek help.
So instead of hiding, we reach out.
Exactly, when we have the courage to ask for help. And we're met with acceptance and empathy, it can change everything.
Right.
It encourages positive behavior and makes us feel like we belong.
Right.
Which reduces the urge to escape through those dopamine activities.
It's like a good cycle.
It is, and Dr. Lembke has great examples of this in action, especially in support groups like AA.
It sounds like honesty is a major theme in the book.
Definitely, it goes beyond addiction. It's about creating a way of life where we're vulnerable, own up to our mistakes, and build real connections based on trust and understanding.
That sounds fulfilling.
It is. It's about realizing that lasting satisfaction comes from something deeper than just chasing dopamine.
This has been eye-opening.
I agree.
But I want to get into some practical stuff now.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned a plenty mindset earlier.
I did.
What does that even mean?
That's a great question, and it's key to the whole book.
Okay.
Dr. Lembke says even though we have so much stuff, we still operate from a place of scarcity.
Especially when it comes to pleasure and reward.
Exactly. We're always wanting more, never feeling content.
It's like we're on a treadmill running but going nowhere.
That's a great way to put it. And this scarcity mindset can make us more prone to addiction.
Because we're always looking for that next dopamine hit.
Precisely. We're never truly satisfied. And it ties into another concept she talks about called delayed discounting.
Okay.
It's this idea that a reward becomes less valuable the longer we have to wait for it.
Interesting.
We tend to overvalue immediate gratification, even if it means missing out on bigger rewards later.
So we prioritize the quick dopamine rush over long-term happiness.
Sadly, yes. And that's where addiction really gets its hooks in.
How so?
Addictive substances and behaviors mess with our reward system. They make it harder to wait for good things and to make choices that are good for us in the long run.
So it's like our brains are working against us.
In a way, yes, but Dr. Lembke doesn't think we're doomed.
Oh, good.
She says when we feel secure and connected and have a sense of purpose, it's easier to resist those temptations.
Okay.
And make choices that support our well-being.
So having a strong foundation helps us weather those dopamine storms.
Exactly.
This is all so fascinating.
I know, right?
I can't wait to learn more about what Dr. Lembke suggests we can actually do to develop that plenty mindset and break free from this constant chase for dopamine.
Well, she explores a whole bunch of practical strategies and tools.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Let's get into those right after this. Okay, so we're back.
Yes.
And we're going to explore some practical tips from Dopamine Nation.
All right, sounds good.
You've convinced me that this plenty mindset is important.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we actually get there?
Well, Dr. Lembke talks about shifting our focus from external rewards to internal satisfaction.
Okay.
It's about enjoying the simple things,
right.
Nurturing relationships, and connecting with a purpose that goes beyond just pleasure.
So it's kind of like mindfulness.
Yeah.
Being present and appreciating what we already have.
You have mindfulness is a huge part of developing a plenty mindset.
Okay.
It's about noticing our thoughts, feelings, and sensations without judging them.
Right.
And learning to just observe those cravings without giving in.
So like instead of grabbing another cookie, we just acknowledge the craving.
Yeah.
And maybe choose something healthier.
Exactly. It's not about depriving yourself.
Okay.
It's about making choices that align with your values and goals.
But that's easier said than done, right?
Oh, for sure.
Especially with all these temptations around us.
It definitely takes practice.
Yeah.
But Dr. Lembke has some good strategies.
Okay, like what?
She talks about setting boundaries, creating structure,
Mm.
and finding healthy ways to manage stress.
Right, those behavioral interventions you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah.
What are some examples?
One she really dives into is dopamine fasting.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's like a cleanse for your brain.
Right, you abstain from those high dopamine things.
Let's go.
To reset your reward system.
It's not just about deprivation, though.
Okay.
It's about choosing to abstain from certain activities.
For a specific amount of time.
Yeah, to break those addictive patterns and rediscover the simple things you enjoy.
So like no social media for a week or no sugary snacks for a month.
Exactly. And the key is finding what works for you.
Right.
It's not one size fits all.
Okay.
Dr. Lembke really emphasizes experimenting and finding strategies that fit your needs and goals.
Makes sense. You mentioned hormesis before.
I did.
How does that fit into all of this?
That's a fascinating part.
Yeah.
Hormesis is this idea that small amounts of stress or discomfort can actually be good for us.
What doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
It sounds weird, but there's a lot of evidence to support it.
Really?
Yeah. Dr. Lembke has some great examples of hormesis in action.
Okay.
Like cold water immersion.
Oh, like ice baths and cold showers.
Exactly. It's become trendy, but it's actually an ancient practice.
What's the science behind it?
Well, research suggests that cold exposure can trigger the release of dopamine and norepinephrine.
Those feel-good chemicals?
Yeah, exactly. It leads to a better mood and makes you more alert.
So it's like a natural high.
You could say that, and it's not just cold exposure.
Okay, what else?
Exercise, intermittent fasting, even electroconvulsive therapy.
Wait, electroconvulsive therapy? That sounds intense.
It is. It's a serious treatment, mostly for severe depression.
Right.
But it shows that what can be harmful in large doses can be good in small, controlled amounts.
That's pretty wild. So embracing a little discomfort can actually make us feel better.
Exactly. It goes back to stepping off that pleasure treadmill.
Right.
And finding enjoyment in the challenges of life.
But how do we know if we're going too far?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Where's the line between a healthy challenge and an unhealthy obsession?
Dr. Lembke talks about that directly.
Okay.
She says self-awareness and listening to our bodies are key.
Okay.
And she has this interesting example about research on rodents who got addicted to running wheels.
Addicted to running? I thought exercise was good.
It is in moderation.
Okay.
But these rodents chose to run all the time.
Really?
Even when they had other options, they neglected their other needs.
Wow.
They basically got hooked on that dopamine rush.
So even healthy things can become problems if we overdo them.
Exactly. It's all about balance.
Right.
Any activity can become unhealthy if it takes over our lives.
Dr. Lembke also talks about deaths of despair.
Right.
How does that connect to dopamine and addiction?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It shows the bigger picture of this addiction buffet we live in.
Okay.
Deaths of despair are the increase in deaths from drug overdoses, alcohol-related illnesses, and suicide.
Right. And it's mostly happening in certain groups of people.
Exactly. And it seems strange that this is happening now.
Right, when we have so much abundance and prosperity.
Exactly, and that's where dopamine comes in.
Okay, how so?
So our world offers us so much pleasure and comfort. But it also creates a kind of emptiness.
So even with all this stuff, people still feel empty and despairing.
Yes, and that emptiness can drive people to seek comfort in those high dopamine activities.
Like drugs, alcohol, or even too much work or screen time.
Exactly. They're trying to fill a void, but those quick fixes just make them feel emptier.
And more disconnected.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It shows how important it is to find meaning and purpose.
Something beyond just chasing pleasure.
Exactly. Dr. Lembke also talks about honesty in relationships.
Okay, how does that fit in?
It's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
She says honesty is crucial for building strong relationships, which then give us that sense of security and belonging that helps us resist those temptations.
So it's about being honest with ourselves and the people we care about.
Exactly. She says we need to create a culture of honesty in our families and communities.
You mentioned she even tells a story about how she accidentally stole chocolate from her kids.
She did. It's a funny story.
Yeah.
But it shows how honesty can actually strengthen relationships.
What happened?
She confessed to her kids and apologized.
Okay.
And they all laughed about it.
So she turned it into a teaching moment.
Exactly. She explained that everyone makes mistakes,
Uh-huh.
but it's important to own up to them.
Right.
And make things right.
It sounds like she was modeling good behavior.
Yeah, she was. And she talks about extending that same grace and forgiveness to ourselves and others.
That's important. So this idea of honesty as a foundation for relationships really makes sense.
It does. And Dr. Lembke also talks about honesty as prevention.
Prevention, how so?
She argues that by teaching kids about honesty without shame, we can help them develop strong morals and avoid addiction.
So we need to create an environment where they feel safe telling the truth.
Exactly, even when they've messed up.
And we need to be honest with them about our own struggles.
Absolutely. Kids learn more from what we do than what we say.
That's true. And this brings us back to building that plenty mindset. Not just for ourselves, but for future generations.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where honesty, connection, and meaning are more important than instant gratification.
That's a great goal. It's about shifting our focus from the what to the why.
Yeah.
And realizing that true happiness comes from something deeper than just chasing those dopamine hits.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
You know, it's amazing how all these things are connected. Honesty, community meaning, and even how our brains work.
Yeah.
Dr. Lembke makes such a strong case for why we need to change how we think about pleasure.
Uh-huh.
Especially in this dopamine nation we live in.
Right. It's a real wake-up call to be more mindful about the choices we make every day and how those choices affect our lives and the people around us.
It's not about living without pleasure, though.
No, not at all.
It's more about finding that balance.
Yeah.
And realizing that true happiness comes from something deeper than just chasing those quick dopamine hits.
She talks about turning towards the world and really experiencing it, instead of trying to escape through distractions.
I like that.
It's about reconnecting with our humanity and embracing the beauty and complexity of life.
One thing that really stuck with me
Yeah.
is this idea that discomfort and pain aren't always bad.
Right.
They can actually help us grow and change.
We've gotten so used to numbing ourselves with distractions and quick fixes that we've lost touch with the full range of human experience.
It's like we're only experiencing a small part of life.
Exactly.
So by leaning into discomfort and letting ourselves feel all of our emotions, we can actually become more resilient.
And improve our well-being.
So it's not about avoiding pain.
Right.
But learning how to deal with it in a healthy way.
Exactly. It's about understanding that pain is a part of life.
Yeah.
And if we try to avoid it all the time, we actually become more vulnerable to things like anxiety, depression, and even addiction.
It's like trying to outrun your shadow.
You can't escape it.
We've talked a lot about honesty, but I'd love to hear more about how it works in those practical strategies for change.
Sure. One thing she emphasizes is finding safe spaces.
Okay.
Where we can be vulnerable and share our struggles and get support without judgment.
Like where?
It could be a therapist's office, a support group, or even a close friend or family member.
Someone you trust.
Exactly. And she also talks about that pro-social shame cycle again.
Right. Using shame to motivate us to seek help.
Yeah, and she has some really moving stories of patients who overcame addiction through that process.
Tell me about one.
Okay, there's this one about Todd.
Okay.
He was a surgeon who said Alcoholics Anonymous was the first place he felt safe being vulnerable.
Wow.
He said he cried so much at his first meeting he couldn't even say his name.
That's intense. What happened?
Everyone came up to him afterwards, gave him their numbers, and told him to call anytime.
That's amazing.
It shows the power of community and sharing your vulnerability with others.
And how empathy and compassion can really change things.
Absolutely. And Dr. Lembke also talks about having that same empathy and compassion for ourselves.
Yeah, that's important.
It's about understanding that we're all human.
Right.
We all mess up. And those mistakes don't define us.
It's about accepting our imperfections.
Yeah.
And realizing they're part of what makes us unique.
I love that, and it's such an important message.
Yeah.
Especially in a culture that's obsessed with perfection.
She also talks about teaching kids about honesty without shame.
Yes, it's about creating a family culture.
Okay.
Where mistakes are seen as opportunities to learn and grow.
So kids feel comfortable coming to us for help.
Exactly, and it's also about being honest ourselves.
Right, like modeling that behavior.
Exactly, because kids learn by watching us.
That's so true. It all comes back to fostering connection.
Yeah.
In our families and our communities.
Throughout this whole deep dive into Dopamine Nation, one theme keeps coming up.
What's that?
This idea of shifting our focus.
Okay.
From what's outside of us to what's inside.
From material things to relationships and values and purpose.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true happiness isn't something we chase. It's something we cultivate.
From within.
Dr. Lemke's book is really a call to action.
Okay.
To rediscover the simple things in life, connect with others in meaningful ways, and find that sense of purpose that gives our lives meaning.
It's been such an insightful and thought-provoking conversation.
I agree.
If you're interested in exploring Dr. Lemke's ideas further, you can find a link to buy Dopamine Nation in our show notes.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive and share this episode with your friends.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this amazing book.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.